When you hear the name Chanel, what comes to mind? Maybe it's luxury, the little black dress, or that iconic perfume Chanel No. 5. For over 100 years, it's been the absolute benchmark for timeless elegance. But you know the story of the brand? It's really the story of one incredible woman, Coco Chanel.
But here's the thing, the woman behind those famous interlocking Cs is so much more complex and, yeah, way more controversial than the pristine brand she built. So to really understand the legend, we've got to peel back all those layers and find the real person hiding underneath.
All right, so to truly get who Chanel was, we have to start with the one story she spent her entire life trying to rewrite, her own childhood. It was a past full of poverty and abandonment, a story she later completely transformed into a carefully crafted myth.
Okay, so she was born Gabrielle Chasnel way back in 1883, and her life was tough right from the get-go. When she was only 12, her mother died. And her father? He just up and abandoned her and her siblings. So young Gabrielle was shipped off to an orphanage at Aubazine. To survive, she started building a whole new identity. First, she was the singer in cafes. That's actually where she got the nickname Coco. And then, with a little help from a wealthy boyfriend, she opened a tiny hat shop in Paris in 1910. Little did anyone know, that was the very first piece of what would become a global empire.
And this is where you can really see her myth-making machine in action. You know that famous logo, right? The interlocking Cs? Well, the official story from the House of Chanel is that it was inspired by the patterns in the stained glass windows at the Aubazine orphanage. It was a really clever way to connect her brand all the way back to those humble, tough beginnings.
But the reality might be a little different from the legend. The brand says her 6 years at Aubazine are what shaped her simple, clean style. But when historians actually dug into the records, they found evidence that she might have never been there at all and was actually living with a cousin. It's just a perfect example of what Chanel did her whole life. If you don't like your past, just invent a better one.
So look, regardless of where she came from, what she did next is absolutely undeniable. It was a revolution. See, Chanel didn't just design clothes. She designed a completely new way for women to exist in the world.
Before Chanel, women were literally cinched into these painful, restrictive corsets. She came along and basically set them free. She took jersey, a cheap fabric that was only used for men's underwear at the time, and made it chic. She borrowed styles from menswear, made the sailor shirt fashionable, and just championed this whole sporty, practical look that for the very first time let women actually move.
And maybe her greatest creation of all was the little black dress. In 1926, Vogue magazine called it the Ford-signed Chanel. Think about that. They were comparing it to a Model T Ford because it was simple, it was accessible, and it was revolutionary. With just one dress, she took the color black from something you only wore for mourning and made it the absolute definition of style. And her revolution didn't just stop with clothes. Oh no. In 1921, she created Chanel No. 5. It was a totally modern, bold scent, and by putting her name on it, she became the very first fashion designer to launch her own perfume. That single move turned her brand into a true luxury empire. But that same ambition, that same opportunism, that made her a genius, it would also lead her down a much, much darker path, right into the shadows of one of the worst moments in history, the Second World War. So when war broke out in 1939, Chanel just abruptly shut down her fashion house. That decision put 4,000 women out of a job, just like that. Now, some say it was a patriotic move, but others argue it was actually payback for these massive employee strikes that had crippled her business a few years earlier. Then, during the Nazi occupation of Paris, Chanel saw an opportunity. She used the Nazis' horrific anti-Semitic laws to try and seize total control of the Chanel No. 5 perfume business from her partners, the Wertheimer family, who were Jewish. But the Wertheimers were a step ahead. They had already transferred ownership to a non-Jewish friend, which completely foiled her plan. But her collaboration went way beyond just business. This is pretty shocking. Declassified intelligence files have since confirmed a pretty ugly truth. Coco Chanel was a registered agent for Germany's military intelligence. Her agent number was F7124, and her code name, Westminster. After Paris was liberated, Chanel was arrested, but she was let go after just a few hours. The reason why has been debated for decades, but a lot of historians think her old friend Winston Churchill pulled some strings to stop a trial that could have been very embarrassing for the British elite. After that, she fled to Switzerland and stayed in exile for a decade.
Now, for most people,
That would have been the end of the story. A disgraced legend living out her days in exile. But we're not talking about most people. We're talking about Coco Chanel. And her final act would be her most improbable, and maybe her most powerful.
So get this, it's 1954. She's been gone for a decade. Her reputation is in absolute tatters, and Coco Chanel decides it's time for a comeback. She was 71 years old.
But the fashion world had totally moved on. The big thing was Christian Dior's new look. You know, those tiny, corseted waists and massive, heavy skirts. It was literally everything Chanel had spent her entire career fighting against. Her response was pure defiance, a simple, comfortable, and totally modern tweed suit.
At first, the French press absolutely hated it. They called it old and tired. But in America, it was a massive success. The Chanel suit became the official uniform for a whole new generation of active, modern women. And just like that, her legacy was cemented for good.
So, after a life with such incredible reinvention, and, let's be honest, such deep controversy, what are we supposed to make of Coco Chanel's legacy? What can we learn from her story?
Well, her life is a masterclass in reinvention, that's for sure. She showed this unbelievable resilience, turning huge failures into triumphs over and over again. But I think the biggest lesson from her story is this: our heroes are never simple. Chanel was both a brilliant, world-changing innovator and a profoundly flawed human being. You can even see this contradiction in her own words. I mean, this is the woman who freed women's bodies from corsets, but she also famously said, "A woman who isn't loved is a nobody." It's a statement that shows both her incredible strength and maybe her deepest insecurity.
So in the end, we're left with this huge question: an innovator who empowered millions of women, or a ruthless collaborator who sided with a hateful regime? The uncomfortable truth is that she was both, and wrestling with that complicated reality is ultimately how we have to remember Coco Chanel.